Growing up, weekends were always spent at my grandmother's house, nestled in a small village where all the homes stood side by side, like one big family. Right next to her house stood an ancient tree, towering over everything around it. Its thick, twisted branches seemed to reach out to the sky, and no matter how sunny it was, that part of the yard was always in shadow. The tree had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Family gatherings were full of joy. We, the children, would run around playing, while the adults chatted and laughed. The dogs, loyal and playful, would often settle beneath the giant tree, finding refuge in its shade. It was a comforting routine. The familiar sounds of our loved ones, the scent of food in the air, and the feeling that we were safe from the world outside. But that tree, despite the happiness around it, always gave me an uneasy feeling. It stood still, as if watching us, its presence both protective and intimidating. It was as though, even amidst the laughter, the tree was keeping a secret. At night, when the gatherings wound down and the children were tucked into bed, the atmosphere would change. The once peaceful yard would fill with the sound of the dogs whimpering under the old tree. It wasn't a soft whine of discomfort. It was something much worse, heart-wrenching howls, as if the animals were in pain, suffering from something unseen. Their cries pierced the silence of the night, unsettling everyone who heard them. The adults, though initially dismissive, couldn't ignore the sounds for long. They would step outside, calling to the dogs, trying to calm them down. But no matter how soothing their voices were, the dogs refused to stop crying. There was something more to their distress, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It wasn't just the sound of animals afraid of the dark. It was deeper, more primal. One night, when the dogs' howls grew too intense to ignore, the family decided to investigate. Flashlights in hand, they ventured toward the old tree. The beams of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the ground. But as they approached, the dogs suddenly went silent. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. They scanned the area, expecting to find some predator or intruder, but there was nothing, only the overwhelming stillness of the night. Confused and unnerved, they returned inside, whispering to one another about the strange occurrence. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows, something that had made itself known only to the animals. The unease lingered long after the dogs stopped crying, leaving the family with more questions than answers. One night, as the family watched from the safety of the house, a tall, dark figure emerged near the base of the old tree. It was a shadow, impossibly black and towering over anything else in the yard. It seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity, its form shifting and blending with the darkness. The figure stood still at first, as if observing the house, and then it slowly crept toward the dogs, who immediately started howling again in terror. The sight of it filled anyone watching with a cold, paralyzing fear. As the shadow grew closer to the tree, the connection became undeniable. This entity was the reason behind the dogs' torment. Every time it appeared, their cries became frantic, their fear almost tangible in the air. The villagers began to murmur amongst themselves, piecing together the strange occurrences. How the shadow only appeared at night and always in the vicinity of the tree. Its presence stirred an ancient fear in the hearts of those who saw it, and it seemed to feed off the unease growing in the village. In an attempt to rationalize what they were seeing, the older residents of the village began to share stories. Some spoke of the tree's dark history, claiming it was cursed long ago by someone wronged. Others believed it was a spirit, restless and trapped, haunting the place where it had died. The myths and tales surrounding the tree only deepened the mystery, making it impossible to know what was real and what was merely superstition. But one thing was clear: the shadow was not a figment of imagination, and its presence filled the village with dread. As the nights passed, the attacks on the dogs grew more violent. Their pained cries echoed through the village, filling the air with a sense of growing dread. It became clear that something malicious was tormenting them. The villagers, desperate for answers, watched helplessly as their once peaceful evenings turned into a nightmare. No matter how hard they tried to bring the dogs inside, Some would always return to the base of the tree, drawn by some invisible force, only to be struck by the shadow's presence. The village's fear intensified as they realized this was no ordinary haunting. One evening, a group of curious children, unaware of the true danger, dared each other to approach the tree. Laughing nervously, they crept closer, their playful spirits quickly fading as the air around them turned cold. Just as they neared the base of the tree, they froze in terror. The shadow appeared once again, taller and darker than before, and it moved toward them with a deliberate slowness. The children felt its malevolent gaze upon them, as if it were reaching out to pull them into the darkness. They screamed and ran, their terrified cries sending a wave of panic through the village. The adults, realizing the situation was growing out of control, rushed to protect their children and the remaining animals. Doors were locked tightly at night, and the children were forbidden from playing near the tree. But despite their efforts, there was no clear solution to stop the shadow. They had no idea how to fight it, or even what it truly was. All they could do was try to keep their loved ones safe, and hope that the attacks would eventually stop. But the presence of the shadow had already taken its toll. The once lively village now lived in constant fear. The tree, once a gathering place, had become a symbol of the darkness that plagued them. And every night, as the wind rustled the branches, the villagers waited, fearing the return of the shadow that stalked the tree and haunted their lives. Even when the shadow wasn't visible, the villagers could feel its presence lingering. The air around the tree always felt heavier, as if the shadow was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The eerie silence that followed the dog's nightly cries only intensified the oppressive atmosphere, making the villagers feel as though they were never truly alone. This unseen terror gnawed at them, leaving them constantly on edge, with the weight of fear pressing down on their once peaceful lives. The psychological toll on the villagers was profound. Children, once eager to visit their grandmother's house, now avoided it, terrified by the memories of the shadow and the sounds of the dog's suffering. Their laughter had been replaced by hushed whispers and anxious glances towards the cursed tree. Even the adults, who tried to remain strong, were haunted by the thought that no matter what they did, they were powerless against the shadow. It was as if the village itself had become a prison, surrounded by an invisible force they could not escape. In the end, the village was left in a state of constant vigilance, always waiting for the shadow to return. They knew, deep down, that the malevolent force wasn't gone. It was merely biding its time. And so, life continued under the shadow's watchful eye, the villagers trapped in an unending cycle of fear and uncertainty, forever unsure of when the darkness might strike again. I've suffered from sleep paralysis for as long as I can remember. It's something I've grown used to over the years, the feeling of being trapped in my own body, unable to move, while shadows and strange figures loom around me. Most of the time, I try to push through the terror, knowing that it will eventually pass. But there was one night, one experience that I still can't shake, no matter how hard I try. It was around Christmas, and my boyfriend and I had traveled to spend the holidays at his parents' house in the countryside. It was a peaceful place, with nothing but open fields and the quiet hum of nature. The night of Christmas Eve was filled with warmth and joy. We had a huge dinner, more than I should have eaten, and eventually, we all retired to bed, feeling content and full. That's when it happened. As soon as I lay down, that familiar sensation crept over me. At first, I thought it was just another one of my usual episodes of sleep paralysis, but this time, it was different. Something, or someone, was there, and I could feel her presence, looming closer. That night, as I fell into sleep, it began. My body was completely paralyzed, and I could feel that same old pressure weighing me down. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow lurking in the corners of my vision. It was a woman, pale, drenched, and angry. She stood over me, her eyes burning into mine, and I could feel her trying to force her way into my body. It was as if she wanted to take control, to push me out of my own skin. I tried to resist, but I couldn't move or scream. The more I tried to fight her, the more furious she became. her face twisted with rage, and her voice echoed in my mind, demanding that I let her in. My heart raced as panic set in. I wanted to wake up, to do anything to break free, but I was completely trapped. Her presence grew stronger, filling the room with a heavy, oppressive energy that made it harder to breathe. Desperate, I somehow managed to wake within the dream. At least, that's what it felt like. I got up from the bed and stumbled through the house, trying to escape her. I wandered past the rooms where everyone was sleeping, seeing their peaceful faces, completely unaware of what was happening to me. But no matter how far I went, I could feel her close behind, her icy breath on the back of my neck, refusing to let me go. When I finally woke up, my heart was still pounding in my chest. I was drenched in sweat, gasping for air, and yet, only 10 minutes had passed since I had fallen asleep. It didn't seem real. The terror I had just experienced felt like hours had gone by. I sat there in the dark, trying to calm myself down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back from the dream. A few days later, after we returned home from the countryside, things took an even stranger turn. My parents, who usually slept peacefully, began to complain about restless nights. My dad mentioned waking up in a cold sweat, and my mom seemed distant, like she hadn't been able to sleep at all. Then, one night, I was jolted awake by the sound of my dad screaming, "No, no, no." His voice was so frantic, so filled with terror, that it sent chills down my spine. The next morning, I asked him about it, but he brushed it off, saying it was just a nightmare. But when my mom began acting strangely too, things got even creepier. One night, I woke up to find her standing by the door, staring out into the darkness, whispering, "No, I won't let you in. Go away." Her voice was firm, but trembling, as if she was trying to fight something off. When I asked her who she was talking to, she simply said it was a woman, wet, dripping with water, standing outside trying to get in. It wasn't until the next morning, when my parents finally talked, that I realized they had both seen the same woman. My dad admitted that he, too, had dreamt of a soaking wet woman trying to force her way into him, demanding entry. My blood ran cold. It was the same woman I had seen during my episode of sleep paralysis. The connection between us, between our dreams and this haunting figure, was undeniable, and it all started that night in the countryside. Terrified by what had been happening, I finally decided to tell my boyfriend about the strange events. My episode of sleep paralysis, the woman trying to enter me, and now, my parents experiencing the same nightmare. His face grew pale as I recounted the details. When I finished, he hesitated before finally revealing something that sent a chill down my spine. Before his parents bought the house in the countryside, a young woman had mysteriously died there. No one knew the exact details, only that her death was sudden and shrouded in dark rumors. The moment he said those words, I felt my stomach drop. Everything started to make sense in the worst way possible. The woman I saw, the wet figure trying to force her way into me and my parents, was it her? Had her spirit been trapped there all this time, seeking out someone to possess, someone to continue her life through? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like we were dealing with something far more sinister than just a lingering presence. A heavy sense of dread settled over us. It was as if we were cursed, marked by whatever had happened to that girl. The thought that she could still be wandering, looking for a body to inhabit, haunted me day and night. My parents were in danger, I was in danger, and none of us knew how to stop it. My mother, sensing the growing darkness around us, began to pray fervently every night. She filled the house with the sound of whispered prayers, lighting candles and sprinkling holy water around our home. I could see the desperation in her eyes. This wasn't just about faith anymore. It was about survival. Each night, as she prayed, I felt the weight of the oppressive energy begin to lift, but it was never completely gone. The fear lingered, hovering just beneath the surface. A few days passed, and things seemed to quiet down. We could sleep again, though always with one eye open. Then, one evening, a family friend came to visit. Over coffee, she casually mentioned how she'd been struggling to sleep lately, waking up in the middle of the night with a feeling of something watching her. My heart sank as I listened. Could it be that the entity was trying to spread? That it had grown restless and was now reaching out to others? The air in the room grew heavy as we all exchanged uneasy glances. My mother clutched her rosary tighter, but I could tell she knew, just as I did, that this wasn't over. The prayers had only managed to hold the darkness at bay. It hadn't been defeated. The entity was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. Though the house felt safer for now, the sense of relief was fragile. We lived with the constant fear that at any moment, the nightmare could begin again. The thought of that wet, desperate figure trying to break into our lives haunted my every waking hour. Deep down, I knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The evil we had encountered wasn't gone. It was just biding its time.